Thank you, Kelly, and everybody for having me today. Hopefully, we'll all leave here knowing a little more about tulips, hopefully a little better at growing them and getting them to come back each year. My background, during school, I worked at an arboretum, so I've got a little experience managing public gardens. We did have some tulips there. We treated them more as annuals, but there's ways you can do it right if you're treating them as perennials. It's really all about making sure you plant them right, making sure you take the yearly steps to keep them healthy. First, let's see. We'll start off just basic background on tulips. They are a true bulb. I'm circling with my cursor if you can see the bulb. This is where all the nutrients are stored in the plant. The leaves are formed inside the bulb, so is the bloom. Going up the plant, this white part of the stem up until about where my cursor is now, where it starts to turn yellow, that is all underneath the soil. It's white because it's not having the sun shine on it, so it's not needing the chlorophyll in the leaves that turns it green. Then we've got the leaves up here, and the blooms are not formed on these bulbs yet. At the bottom of the bulbs, they're teardrop shaped. So at the bottom, the circular part is where the roots come out. If you looked at the bottom of that bulb, you'd see a circle that looked different than the rest of the bulb, and that's the spot where the roots come out. So when you buy tulips, most of the time you see them in the fall at the store as bulbs. You might see some in the spring in pots. Typically, those are about to bloom, and it might not be the best idea to plant them until after they bloom and the leaves start to die back. But you can buy them from most retailers in the fall. If you're looking for very large amounts, maybe you want a big patch of tulips, maybe you want to grow enough to cut and harvest and sell. You can find larger amounts online from like seed websites, bulb websites. They'll also have larger varieties, different colors. You should be able to find what you're wanting online. They typically come in these breathable bags. They should come in the breathable bags. If they don't, I would be a little cautious in purchasing those because the breathable bags prevent the bulbs from rotting. They also prevent the bulbs from starting to force. So when we talk about forcing bulbs, this is either done hydroponically, so just in water, or in fresh growing media, soilless media. And we're doing it very fast. We're forcing the bulbs to use up all their stored energy and food in the bulb to force out a big, beautiful bloom very quickly. This uses up all of the nutrients, and the bulb then is not viable. So you want to prevent any moisture from getting to the bulbs until you're ready to plant them. You want to store the bulbs in a cool, dry location. So we plant the bulbs in the fall. If you purchase them early and you aren't ready to plant yet, you need to store these in a cool, dry spot. Avoiding the direct or heavy light will prevent them from trying to put out the leaves and get the process going of blooming. So when you have your bulbs and it's the fall and you're ready to plant, you want to make sure you're planting at least 6 inches deep. So this is typically about 3 times as deep as the bulb is tall. Most bulbs that you buy are going to be about 2 inches tall. So we want it to be at least 3 times as deep. If you buy bulbs that are significantly smaller than that, tulip bulbs, I mean, you want to make sure that you are prepared to not have blooms for several years. So when you're purchasing the bulbs at that 2-inch height, that means those bulbs are several years old. The people that grow the bulbs let these bulbs mature for several years. That gets them to the stage where they're ready to bloom their biggest. So that's what people want to plant, is when the bulb is going to produce the biggest flower. So those you need to make sure they're those 6 inches deep, so that the bulb has enough support to sustain the weight of those big heavy leaves and then the big blooms. When we get wind and all the rain in the spring, these leaves and blooms become really heavy. So the water knocks them down, the wind pushes them over. If they're planted very shallow, they're going to stay on the ground. If they're 6 inches deep, they should remain upright and hopefully as sturdy as possible. I mentioned the top point tip of the bulb that needs to be pointed straight up. Most bulbs are not like seeds where they can you can just throw them in the hole and they'll find their way to the surface. The roots know to go down. The stems and cotyledons, those first leaves, know how to find their way to the surface. Bulbs either can't expend that energy in correcting the orientation, or they just can't do it physically. So you want to make sure they're pointed straight up. When it comes to spacing, you can plant your tulips, they can be as close as about 2 centimeters apart from each other. This picture on the right is from a cut flower grower. So they plant tulips as close as possible because they're treating these bulbs like annuals. They'll be pulling these out once they bloom. So they don't care how close these bulbs are. If you plan to leave them in the ground from year to year, you need to make sure you give them enough space, because the bulbs will put off new shoots. They'll start to form small little bulbs off the sides. You want to make sure they have enough space for them to grow several years. So you can space them a few inches apart instead of that 2 centimeters. But if you plan to pull them out, you just want the big blooms one year and you want to replant the next year, feel free to plant them very close. This provides a lot of support. They help hold each other up. If you plant in small clusters or clumps, they'll support each other. But tulips also do okay on their own. So you could place them several feet from each other and they should do okay, as long as your soil is going to hold them upright. So we've dug our holes, we've set our bulbs 6 inches deep, and before we backfill the soil into the hole, we want to water the bulbs first. So this is, we're planting them 6 inches deep. It's not like a potted plant where we've got soil up to the surface with roots from the plant. And the water on top of the soil can reach those roots easily. We have to make sure our water is going to reach 6 inches into the soil. So if we water it first, that will provide the soil down there a lot of moisture that it will hold on to for a good amount of time, since it's not exposed to the sun and the wind. After you water the bulbs, then you backfill with your soil. And then it's a good idea to top the soil with some compost, up to 1 inch or so. This compost is going to provide nutrients for the plants. It's going to help control moisture. It will keep more water in the soil. And it will also just add organic matter to your soil, which improves the overall health of your soil for years to come, not just for these tulips right now. You could also try a mulch on top. A mulch is going to hold less water. It will help keep some of the weeds down, but usually tulips are going to come up before a lot of your weeds are coming up. But a mulch, if you can't do compost, a mulch with manure should be good enough nutrient and moisture control. So before we get into planting them in the landscape, I want to talk on the cold treatment that is needed for tulips to bloom. So tulips need, depending on the variety, they need between 10 and 20 weeks of chilling period in order to have blooms and long stems. So the traditional, just plain tulips are probably going to have maybe even down to 8-week chilling time period they need. So about 8 for some, up to 15 is about your normal. But some of the double varieties and some of the large parrot varieties need up to 20 weeks of chilling in order to bloom. So when I talk about chilling, I'm talking about a temperature of between 35 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is a sustained temperature, so we don't want fluctuation. It's not going to be cumulative. It's going to be, one period. We don't want it cold and then warm a few weeks and then back down to cold. So this can either be the soil temperature, or it can be the temperature of the air if you're storing them as dry, unplanted bulbs. So if you plant them in the fall, that will provide and should provide enough weeks of that cold temperature throughout the winter in order for the blooms to be big and the stems to be long. This year is an exception. We had a short winter, we had a warm winter. So some of the varieties of tulips didn't have enough cold. The picture on the right, you can see the hot pink tulips. That's just a normal, regular tulip. They were able to get to close to the size we wanted this year. The white tulips you see are a double tulip. So they've got multiple layers of petals. Most of the doubles this year did not receive enough cold. And so a lot of them either didn't bloom at all, or they had really short stems. So that's something to consider if you for sure want those bulbs. You can buy those blooms, you can buy pre-chilled bulbs. This ensures those blooms in the springtime. That would be only applicable for the first year. So if you wanted to keep these in the ground, have them come back next year, you would not be able to ensure that bloom period or that chilled period for the blooms. But if you buy pre-chilled bulbs, most of the time the packages will say they may cost just a little bit more, but it shouldn't be too bad compared to the non-pre-chilled. And you could also chill the bulbs yourself. Putting them in a refrigerator should be okay, as long as you don't keep a lot of produce. We want to avoid fridges that have a lot of moisture, or fridges that have a lot of produce that are releasing ethylene gas that will ripen the fruit, but it will harm the bulbs. So this cold treatment isn't very important unless you really want tall, big blooms. If you're fine just leaving them in your landscaping, that is okay. I just wanted to mention this, especially if you're designing a bed that you want blooms in for a specific reason. It might be a good idea to plant them new every year. So some tips for planting in a landscape. So when we're planting in the landscape, we do want to give them more space than if we were just treating them as annuals. If we're treating them as perennials, we need to give them at least 2 or 3 inches apart. You do plant in the fall, so this gives them time for that chilling. It should give them time. Like this year was not the best for them, but most years it's been okay. A good time to plant them is when you pull out your mums or your other annual plants that you had planted throughout the spring and summer. So when you pull those out in the fall, maybe September, late October, that's a good time to go ahead and drop those tulips in the ground. When you would plant pansies, that's about the same time. So planting tulips, pansies, and other bulbs like hyacinth and daffodils, you can plant those all at the same time, and that will give you a nice full bed of spring blooms. So those pansies will start blooming, then your tulips will pop up along with your daffodils, and then a few weeks later, maybe your hyacinth will pop on up. When you do this, you could plant them very randomly. So here's a tulip, here's a pansy, and then here's a daffodil, and now's another tulip. Or you could do clusters. I mentioned earlier those clusters and clumps help provide more support and stability. So you could do, here's a clump of tulips, here's a clump of hyacinth, here's a clump of pansies. Either way really works for the state of Kentucky. But if you're like here in West Kentucky, we've had a lot more wind lately. So I did see a lot of tulips laying on the ground, bent over from the wind. So if you want to provide some more support, a cluster or a clump would be the way to go. You can also plant tulips with your perennial plants. So it's not just for annual flower beds. If you have a bed that you don't really do much with each year, the plants just come back each year, they do their own thing. You may weed or you may mulch each year, but you're not doing much. Tulips can still fit into that bed. So you can plant them pretty close to some of your perennial plants, like echinacea, daylilies, maybe some liriope, things that are going to die back in the fall, and you won't really see their remnants in the early spring if you've removed them after the green has died back. These are things you could plant nearby, and they'll come up, bloom, and start to be, receding by the time other perennials are starting to leaf out and then bloom. This gives you several months of color without having to, redo your beds all the time. With this, I would give your tulips more space than normal, maybe 5 or 6 inches from each other and from the other plants. Roots of other plants shouldn't affect the tulip bulbs too much unless they're causing a lot of, compaction, or you're seeing roots start to rise to the surface. Then you might want to do something to loosen some of your soil around your tulips so they make sure that to come up without having to fight through the hard soil. So the decision you have to make is whether you want to treat them as annuals or perennials. Neither way is easier than the other. In certain parts of the state, you'll have more difficulty getting them to come back and be really healthy each year. It's all about the soil and how well you take care of them. The drawback to leaving them in the ground is that they will get smaller each year. So the blooms will be smaller and the stems will be shorter. And then also along with that is variation in height. So I can't say they lose an inch a year, they lose 2 inches a year. It just depends on the bulb and whatever else it decides to do. So when you plant them all the first year, you can expect them all to be about the same height. All your blooms will sit about the same height off the ground. That's how we get those beautiful fields of tulips where everything looks perfect and symmetric. With the next year, some might stay that height. Some may be that same height, but then the one next to it might be a few inches smaller. And then the one next to that might be a few inches shorter than that. So you really can't tell what it's going to do. But if you're okay with that variation, then that shouldn't be a problem for you. But it will continue to get shorter and smaller each year. Hyacinth is another bulb that does this. And that one is very easy to see because they get very small each year compared to the previous. So if you do this, you may have to replace the bulbs every few years anyway. Some of the tulips will produce offshoots, new bulbs that are forming off the other bulbs. Typically, that's not going to be a whole ton of them. It's not going to be like a daylily or a hosta where you have to divide it every year. But if you do have good soil and you leave them in the ground, you may have to space them a little more every few years. But typically after several years, you may see a dieback from the tulips. This may be caused by rotting in the soil as the soil becomes compact around them. As the bulb gets bigger each year, or more roots are taking up space, the soil becomes harder as it's pushing that soil out. So you may see more rot as water gets down in there. There's not much place for it to go because of that compaction in the soil. So you may see some rot in those older bulbs. If you do decide to leave them and treat them as perennials, you need to make sure you leave those leaves on. They need to be left on for at least 2 months after the blooms are spent. This is how they replenish stored nutrients. I should note, if they turn completely brown, then it's okay to remove those leaves, but give them at least 2 months or until they turn brown. The leaves are how they replenish the nutrients and the energy that is stored in the bulb that is then used to produce the leaves and the blooms for next year. So it's not, if you throw down some fertilizer in the spring for your bulbs, it's really not going to affect the bloom or the leaf size that year. It would affect next year's. But those leaves, if you let them turn brown completely, that means they've pulled all of the nutrients from the tip of the leaf all the way into the bulb. And then they've got that stored energy that they can use next year. People make this mistake all the time. As soon as the bloom is gone, they either come through with a weed eater or hand clippers and they just remove all those leaves. And the bulb then has no way to store much nutrients. It can store some through the roots, but it's not as much as it could. Also, if you decide to cut some of the flowers off to maybe take inside, put on your table, you want to leave at least 2 leaves attached so that it can store some energy. But if I had to point to a number one reason why bulbs and other plants that bloom early in the spring don't come back the next year, it's because people like to remove those leaves. Iris, as soon as the iris blooms are gone, people just take all those, and that's how we see irises being lost. So give them as much energy as you can, and they should do good the next year. Some common problems we see in tulips that are left in the ground or even brand new tulips sometimes. These are things that we can try to offset, but some of them are just out of our control. But if you like to know a reason why your tulips aren't blooming as well, we might be able to diagnose it. So if it's not blooming at all, you've got leaves coming up, you've had some tulip varieties bloom and some just have the leaves and nothing else. The reason is probably that cooling period. So this was the case for a lot of tulips this year. Some right next to other varieties came up, did fine, and then the ones right next to it, no blooms. That's because that variety didn't have enough of that cooling period. It could also be a fertility issue. Tulips can be susceptible to nitrogen, too much nitrogen. Iris is the plant I point to specifically for too much nitrogen. What nitrogen does is promotes vegetative growth. So you have lots of nice, beautiful leaves that are real green, but then you don't have a lot of reproductive growth. So the flowers. Typically, if you plant tulips along a lawn, just like iris, if you plant tulips and iris along a lawn, the nitrogen that is in grass fertilizer can sometimes affect those plants and keep them from blooming as well or even at all. There are lots of other landscape plants that can be susceptible to this as well. You see lots of big green leafy plants and small to no blooms. And that could be a nitrogen issue. So just watch where you're planting them. Make sure your lawn fertilizer isn't being spread up around your tulips, and that shouldn't be too much of a problem. Small flowers, so if you've got small flowers, this could be the age of the tulip bulb. So several years in the ground, you could see smaller flowers and shorter stems. Fertility issues could also be a cause of the small flowers. So that could be the nitrogen. It could be some other nutrients that are needed to help the bulb be as healthy as possible. And then that short cool period could also be a cause. Pretty much the same thing for those short stems, the age of the bulb, the cool period, but also a harder rocky soil. So if your soil is pretty hard, maybe it's got a lot of clay that seals up and gets really hard, or you've got lots of rocks that get in the way of the stems trying to push their way upward each year, you could have shorter stems. They might use too much energy trying to get to the surface and then can't go much further. So maybe loosening your soil when you plant the bulbs, digging up your old bulbs every several years and kind of loosening the soil and then replanting might not be a bad idea for that. Yellow leaves, this is also fertility issues, but probably needs some more nitrogen, or maybe magnesium, other things like that. Phosphorus could be your cause. And also poor drainage. So if you see yellow, light brown leaves before blooms, that could be a poor drainage issue. So you're having rot starting to form in those bulbs. You're losing roots because of that rot. Or maybe too much water is leaching your nutrients. So you're not having those nutrients and available to the bulbs. So you're seeing those yellow leaves. And then one I've been hearing about more recently than in the past is bloom abortion. So this is when the tulip is on track. It looks like it's going to bloom. The bloom is very small, a couple inches or so, and then it just turns brown, falls off, or just turns brown, and the whole plant starts to turn brown. This could be caused by excessively warm temperatures, specifically when the bulb is unplanted. So as your bulbs are being stored, if they're not in a cool space, it may cause this bloom abortion once they get planted. And then that ethylene gas I mentioned earlier, if you're chilling or storing your bulbs near produce, the produce is probably giving off that ethylene, and that could over-ripen the bulb and then cause those blooms to not open. And another tip I've got for you is keeping track of the bulbs. So this is something that could be applied to any plant, any seed or bulb that you're sowing or planting. I made this mistake a few weeks ago. I sowed some stuff out in the garden, forgot to flag it, and then I hoed the seedlings up because I thought they were weeds. Same can be said for bulbs. But the tulips come out pretty early, but this still may be the case if you're early to get out there and start cleaning up your flower beds. You might accidentally pull them up, weed eat them, hoe them, or even spray them if you're spraying an herbicide. In the springtime, we get in cleanup mood. We're ready to be outside. We're ready to work in the garden. So we start pulling up every weed we can to prevent bad issues later on. and then we accidentally hit some things that we weren't supposed to. So it's a good idea to label where you plant them, because we're planting them in October, November, maybe even as early as September, depending on your temperatures. So by the time they're coming up, we've forgotten where they were exactly. The soil has settled. If we mulched, then there's no way for us to tell. So just label where you put them. If you want to remember the colors and the varieties, go ahead and make those tags for that as well. And then I just wanted to tack on a few tips for cutting the flowers. Like we mentioned, I work with our cut flower growers here in the state. So just real quick, this is if you want to cut some of your tulips to bring inside and put on your own table or give out to other people as gifts. You want to harvest when the color is barely showing. So in this picture on the right, just the slightest hint of pink at the tips of these blooms. This will, if we harvest at this point, this will give us our longest base life. Tulip blooms will continue to have that color spread throughout all the petals. The petals will open up and take that cup shape. And then as it warms up, they'll open up even more. And in addition to the blooms getting the color and opening, the stems will straighten and lengthen over the first few days as they start to take in water. So if your tulips was flopped over on the ground and kind of curved up, water will help that straighten. And then if you've got really short stems, they may lengthen a little bit as well in the first few days. And then just some fun information on commercial cut flowers. So the growers in our state treat tulips as annuals. They plant those bulbs, centimeters apart. When it's time to harvest and those tips of those flowers are showing color, they rip the whole bulb out of the ground. This allows them to wrap those bulbs up in bunches. They lay them flat in their floral cooler, and they can keep them there for several weeks. That bulb has all the nutrients and energy they need to survive those few weeks. The cool temperatures keep those blooms from getting more color and opening up until you want them to. And it just allows for a longer shelf life. And it lets them cut the longest stem as possible. On this picture here, where my cursor is about where it would be cut off. So you've got a lot longer stem than you would if you left it in the ground. That's just some fun information on how you would treat it as an annual. If you decide to treat your own landscape tulips as annuals, you would just pull them up whenever the blooms are done, and then compost that plant material and those bulbs, and use that to fertilize your garden in the next year. And then just replant. Replanting is going to allow you to have the biggest blooms possible, and the most uniform planting as possible.